Have you ever gazed in wonder at the Great Pyramid? Have you marveled at the golden face of Tutankhamun? Or admired the delicate features of Queen Nefertiti? If you have, you'll probably like the History of Egypt podcast. Every week, we explore tales of this ancient culture. The History of Egypt is available wherever you get your podcasting fix. Come, let me introduce you to the world of ancient Egypt.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamoda and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. Hey, Danny, are you done eating?
Yeah, I'm done eating, man.
All right. We were recording, but Danny was eating a yogurt. And I don't know. I think one of the worst offenses you can do while recording a podcast is eat something on the other side.
What was that thing that I used to eat that you used to get so pissed off about when we would record? There was like a thing over the summer that I was just like hooked on eat.
Vaping.
No, well, vaping, yeah, but not just specifically vaping, but something that I was eating. What was that?
I don't know. Was it like almonds or something? Or nuts?
I think so. And you were just like, and I would like try to like mute myself in between and try to act sly, but you would always catch it. And you would fucking yell at me the entire time.
Yeah. So I used to get mad at Danny for two things: either eating something while we were podcasting or vaping. And Danny would think I would never hear the vaping when we were actually recording the show. I would only hear it after, like, while editing the podcast or after listening to it. So I would be Danny like, yeah, don't worry, I'm muting myself when I vape. So I'd be like, all right, fine. Like, I don't hear it, so probably the audience doesn't hear it. Then I would listen to the episode, and then I just hear this sound. And I was like, Danny! I thought you weren't going to vape.
I kicked the habit, so.
Yeah. I guess to get... I wasn't getting that mad. I was just like, God damn it.
It just made the editing process harder. Because
no
then you had
vaping!
You had to manually mute me.
Because you can't see the vape on the bar. You can't see their sound waves, really.
Right.
You just have to
because it's like super low.
It's such a subtle noise. I don't know if other people hear that shit. I hear it on other podcasts sometimes, so I guess it's not big of a deal.
Yeah.
When it's your show, you're like hypersensitive to anything that can come in the background. So we know like all the things that aren't like perfect about the recording environment. Right. I'm sure a lot of audio snobs listening are aware of them as well. But for the most part, you know, I don't know. When I'm listening to someone else, if the audio is not perfect, I don't really give a shit. You know what I mean? It doesn't really bother me.
Right.
As long as it's not out of a tin can, I'm fine. But like with our show, if I hear like me adjusting my seat, like, it sounds like I don't know, like a fart. I'm like, oh, God damn it. I can't even take that shit out. But whatever, I guess.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. It's like anytime I'm talking, I have to make sure that I'm absolutely still. And then I'm not clicking anything. And then I don't like shift in my chair because then all you hear is like...
And dude, when we were recording in our old environment, so
oh, God.
I used to live next to a hospital, and Danny used to live next to a bar.
Right.
And
across the street from a bar on the first floor.
Yeah. So I would have an ambulance passing every single 10 minutes. It'd just be like, and it would just be insane. Like, it would just be nonstop. And there were times when we would get so frustrated. Well, I would get so frustrated. I'm like, I'm done recording this episode. Like, I cannot work like this. I guess for me,
it used to be like sirens in general, whether like police sirens or ambulance sounds, like, or just general street noise, was always like kind of part of the show for like the first like year and a half of us doing it.
We couldn't even adjust to it. That we had to be like, haha, there's another siren, haha, there's another COVID death. Like, that was basically the joke, because during COVID, I lived next to the emergency hospital that was put up in place in Central Park. So there's a lot of sirens.
But we both moved. and we're both in quieter places, and we both got better equipment. And slowly but surely, I feel like we're getting to a place where it's like better.
It sounds semi-professional. I wouldn't say professional. I would say semi-professional. Just not amateur, like, our first year and a half of doing this show.
Every now and again, though, we do record an episode that's like the content of it is really great, but for whatever reason, we might have just too much background noise. And like when we're processing out that background noise, it just kind of sounds like we're talking out of a tin can. So you'll still get that every now and again. So please be patient.
Today may be one of them. You never know what the internet has in store for us.
Who knows?
But let's start. Let's get into today's topic. This is, I don't even know what part it is. I'm tired of presenting this as a multi-part series because, we've been trying to make these episodes stand alone while then being within a larger series of episodes. Something we're probably not capable or qualified of doing perfectly. So essentially, we're doing a series on the birth of the Japanese nation state. So looking how nations are built and looking how nationalism spreads throughout a country. So what makes a nation? And the standard narrative when it comes to the rise of Japanese nationalism is that it was a response from Western encroachment. So in the 19th century, there was a number of incidents that frightened the Japanese ruling class very much. The two major ones being the defeat of China during the Opium Wars and the arrival of Mr. Commodore Perry, who basically demanded that Japan open up their border through gunpoint diplomacy.
Gunboat diplomacy.
So the old black ships, that's what the story is. So Commodore Perry, basically the U.S. government was reading about Japan. They said, hey, Pacific is kind of like our sphere of influence. We might as well get into this. Japan hasn't been conquered yet by the other European powers, so why don't we go over there and try to establish some trading relationships? And at this point in history, Japan was like, we have a pretty strict isolation policy. We only trade. We have one little trading outpost with the Dutch, and we're not accepting any visitors. And then Commodore
that part
Perry,
was particularly hilarious because they would relegate the Dutch to like this very like tippy bottom southernmost like island, and then they wouldn't even let them get off the boat. They'd be like, "All right, just throw us the stuff, and we'll throw you the cash, and that's it." Hilarious how they did it.
Yeah, so they were isolationist, just at the very least, until Matthew Perry came and started launching cannons with modern ships at the time, and the Japanese said, okay, well, this is going to be an issue. We're not going to be able to actually fight these fleets and these modern armies with what we have right now.
With our samurai swords.
With their samurai swords. They had guns at the time, but
I know. I'm overly simplifying, but that's the basic idea.
So, in short, the power holders of Japan realized that they had to modernize to avoid being colonized by the rest of the world. So the feudal system that was part of Japan for the past 600 years at this point was dismantled, and missions were sent to America and European countries to study things like constitutionalism, Western politics, modern militaries, healthcare, and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And of course, this was, for a lot of Japanese, this stuff was awesome. Like, right. I remember reading the story about this Japanese doctor. The first time he read a Western anatomy book, he broke down in tears crying because he realized what he was practicing was voodoo, basically. Like, it was just false. It was false science once he saw a Western anatomy book. So they adopt all these good things. Japan's on this path to modernity, and we have our first nation state with conscription, a centralized government, and then an education system. Now, I have a thought on this, and this is something one of the reasons why we're doing this series is not to, again, I want to just repeat, like, never listen to this podcast and come away thinking that we're some authoritative, like, sources or authoritative figures in this space. We are definitely not.
Nope. We
do this podcast to indulge in our own interest and what we we want to have an excuse to look into these things and study these things and know these things. So we do this show, and a lot of it is in pursuit of questions that we have in mind. And I want to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think that nationalism was a uniquely European phenomenon, or did nationalism spread to the rest of the world via diffusion? So it spread from Europe to the rest of the world.
Well, I don't think that it's uniquely European right now, because we see nationalism kind of popping up in a bunch of different places, in a bunch of different flavors. And sometimes it pops up in ways that had nothing to do with, the European brand of nationalism. On the other hand, European nationalism definitely has an impact on a lot of, non-Western states, insofar as it shapes how certain types of nationalism, like Japanese nationalism in this particular episode that we'll discuss, how they're formed. But as far as like diffusion goes, I'm just not super I'm not convinced about that just yet. I might change my mind at the end of the episode, but like right now, I'm not super convinced at it, because it seems like there's a sufficient amount of like organic things that are happening inside of Japan that are, formulating at least the basis for nationalism, right? So I can't quite say that I think that specifically Japanese nationalism rose as an offshoot of just European nationalism. I'm not sure. What do you think?
I'm not sure either. That's the question I'm having trouble answering. Was nationalism something that emerged from Europe and spread throughout the rest of the world? So was it a copied and paste type system, or was nationalism, did every nation develop its own kind of form of nationalism, and they just maybe use European nationalism as a template for their own? I don't know. These are questions that we're trying to come to terms with and answer. But I think a good place to start is the concept of the imagined community. Have you ever heard of that concept, the imagined community?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is actually coined from a political scientist named Benedict Anderson, and what he says is that a nation is just an imagined political community. Mm-hmm. He basically says a nation is imagined because it's not possible for members of a nation to know all the other members of that nation. However, in their minds, they live in some type of community or fraternal community. And you ultimately need this type of fraternal bond between citizens for you to have a nation. So this shared culture links people together, even if they don't have any type of personal relationship. Now, you can tackle this on a micro level, and it makes a little bit more sense.
Right.
You went to Rutgers, right?
Hell yeah, go RU. All
right. So would you say that you're part of the Rutgers community?
Yep. I bleed scarlet.
You bleed scarlet. Are you?
That's what they say.
That's what you say? Do you seriously bleed scarlet, or?
Well, I mean, everybody bleeds scarlet when you think about it.
But are you like, let's just say you're hiring somebody. Mm-hmm. If they go to Rutgers, will that make you be like, oh, you went to Rutgers? Oh, like, will that give them favor over somebody else?
No.
If they're equal candidates, like,
they're all equal in my eyes. I mean, it's an easy way to start a conversation with me, though. I will say that.
But there's some type of community, like, oh, like you went to Rutgers, I went to Rutgers. You have some shared bond there.
Of course, 100%. Okay.
Now, did you know every single person at school?
Not even close, dude. I graduated with like 10,000 people, and we did it in the stadium. Not even close.
Yeah, so Rutgers, we had 10,000 people in your graduating class?
That's right, and that was just undergrads.
I didn't realize how big Rutgers was. They must have 40,000 undergrads?
Yep, something like that at the time that I was in school, yeah.
Jesus. So it's impossible for you to have a personal relationship with a community that large.
Right.
So therefore, what bonds you together is this identity that we all went to the same school and, whatever,
Right.
value that to school. Even the schools itself will be like, the Rutgers man is honorable, or they probably wouldn't use that language now, but that the Rutgers, that would be more of like a fraternal society, or like the Freemason is a gentleman.
Yeah, okay.
But
no, but I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. It's like the community of people that I went to school with. We have this shared identity. We all went to Rutgers. We all have a loosely shared experience of going to the same university and in many cases living in the same area and experiencing a lot of the same shared things, like how we all love fat sandwiches, or how there's the myth of Rutgers having its own STD, or how
you have your own Rutgers STD myth?
It's a lie, but that was the myth that was going around at the time. And then there was another one, how there was this giant party that used to always happen that was free, called Rutgers Fest, and they would invite like major like artists to play shows and stuff like that. And then my class happened to be the last time they did it because someone got shot in the ass on College Avenue. And it was like a major riot. There was like cars and couches and shit on fire. It was absolutely nuts. But if you went to school at the same time that I did at Rutgers in New Brunswick, you got to experience Rutgers Fest at that time. I think it was 2010. And that was the last one. You couldn't have Rutgers Fest anymore because of the ridiculous riot that ensued. But that created this, as you say, imagined camaraderie, this imagined community around, among tens of thousands of people that don't really know each other, but they share this like loose thing. And a lot of the times, part of it, that community is also comparing against other communities, right? Like we hate Penn State. We just do. The Nittany Lions suck. We don't like them, right? But, it's like the us versus them, like I don't know this Joe Schmo that, is a fucking philosophy, major or something like that. And I don't know, Wendy whatever that is a journalism major, but we both go to Rutgers.
It's funny that you say that Rutgers. I want to put a pin in this, the Rutgers STD at Hofstra University. And I didn't go to Hofstra. I went to CW Post in Long Island, but we were neighbors with Hofstra. There was their own. It was called a Hofstra Blue and a Hofstra Red, and like the Hofstra Blue was worse than the Hofstra Red. There was two STDs that were apparently only native to Hofstra University. But another interesting thing is that I went to visit Rutgers one time. I went to a friend's fraternity house, and someone was murdered like 2 blocks down.
That sounds like
from where they were staying. It sounds pretty typical, like that night. And I was like, oh, how about that? This is a horribly dangerous area.
Yep.
But yeah, you need this identity. And funny that you bring up Penn State, because I find that people from Penn State are like really into being in Penn State. Do you know anyone who went to Penn State?
Yeah, I do. I had a coworker of mine from one of the first gigs that I got here in New York City, and he was actually the mascot. He was the Nittany Lion, and he was so full of.
He was the guy who covered up everything for Joe Paterno.
No, I wouldn't say that. No, he was a good dude. But he also was like very, very Penn State, and on that particular bit, I don't think we saw eye to eye.
It's kind of funny. People from Penn State, and I've noticed this more with any other school, I don't know what they put in the water over there in Happy Valley, but they are like a cult. Penn State
we all are. Honestly, we all are. All the universities are.
It's more. I don't give a fuck about my alumni. Like I'll be serious. Like I don't give a shit.
Well, that's because you went to one of the lesser schools.
I didn't go to a great school. I went to a tier 2 type, tier 3 probably college. However,
but I mean, like to expand this out beyond just our United States audience, because we do get some commentary about how we get too deeply in the weeds about American or even northeastern kind of esoteric ideas. This idea of like university on university, like kind of rivalry exists literally everywhere, all over the place. So, just if you're in, England, replace it with like Oxford. If you're, in other places, replace it with
like
the university of your choosing,
soccer teams,
or the like soccer
Arsenal
teams, the major football teams, all over the world, your particular Bundesliga favorites,
in England,
wherever you
they
are.
Fucking kill you. They fucking kill you over soccer.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you a West Ham fan, you blokes.
Exactly. So it doesn't. The examples that we are sharing are obviously are specifically our lived experiences, but you can find these examples all over the place in plenty of different ways of this imagined camaraderie, this imagined community.
And nations that don't have these imagined communities, a lot of times don't really succeed. You can use some examples of nations that are just divided by a lot of different factors and cultures. Ethiopia is one that comes immediately to mind. Ethiopia is currently in a civil crisis where you have one of their kind of one of their states or ethnic states at odds with the rest of the country. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Ethiopia, there's about 84 different. There's more than that. I forget the exact number, but there's dozens and dozens of different ethnic groups and cultures and languages that are spoken within Ethiopia.
Right.
And the major dominant ethnic groups, they dominate different parts of the country. The Tigray were in power for a long time, and now the Amora are more or less in power. And there's a lot of friction between the two, and there's basically a war that's been going on up there. Now, one of the reasons why their government system is called ethnic federalism. Mm-hmm. They have a very difficult time forming like a strong, confident, unified nation state because of all these different cultures that are in odds with each other. And then there's a lot of it creates this, since there's still a centralized government that technically controls the country but these regions have a certain level of autonomy. There's always this fight for control of the centralized government, right, meaning that there is always friction between different ethnic groups there. Mm-hmm. So,
and it doesn't always shake out to be that the people that are the majority, like most of the people, end up in power. In the example that you said, the Tigray are a minority. They don't hold as many like human beings, like population, as other groups in Ethiopia. However, they did hold on to power for quite some time. So it was like a minority rule.
And you also see this in the Middle East as well. You have like different political factions that are at odds, and the political factions are in reality are or I should change the way I rephrase this. You have different religious factions that are in reality political factions that are always kind of pulling for control of the central government, creating a friction in this concept of a unified nation state. So without civic nationalism, or without this kind of strong civic unity, it doesn't always lead. You can copy the Western, the Western system of nationalism, or the Western system of nationalizing the country under one culture. But if you don't have that foundation, then you're unable to. It's harder to make an actual successful state. That's kind of what the theory is. I'm not saying that's my belief. I'm just saying that is the kind of like the modern way of looking at nationalization, or the nationalization process. Now, there is a theory called it's the concept of multiple modernities. And it was first introduced by Shmuel Eisenstadt. And essentially what this implies is that the Western view of modernity doesn't really apply to all societies. Like, modernity is very much subjective to a nation's own stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So what it does, what this framework does, it it forces you to adopt the definition of a nation as just a political community with its own personality whose membership is limited, rather than a political system that has not only have a limited membership, but also has gone through the process of modernization and modernity. Right. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to myself? Like, whenever you say "does that make sense," you're always saying you're saying it to yourself. Like, did I just make a coherent sentence? I think I did. Like, right?
I think so.
Was that coherent?
I think so. Yeah.
I think it was moderately coherent. Now, the question that we're interested in answering is, when does that unique personality develop in Japan? And what was that foundation of Japanese national consciousness? Like, when does that go back? Because it's impossible to look at Meiji Japan and just say, oh man, someone just farted out a nation state, like, out of nowhere in 40 years. Like, it just happened. Like, right. They were feudal, and then 40 years later, they're a nation state. You can't just form something like that so quickly. There needs to be some level of unity already among the members of that nation state to actually make something like that happen so successfully. Because we're talking about one of the most successful nation states of all time built. Right. And it was built in 40 years, according to the contemporary popular Western narrative on the Japanese nation state.
Right.
So,
but I don't necessarily think that's entirely true either, because nothing just springs up overnight, as you say. And I think to answer the question of where is the foundation of this Japanese national consciousness coming from, I think we might have to recap some of the shit we've talked about on the last couple episodes, so we can try and understand it better. So I'll try to do that. So one of our first episodes, we talked about like the early ancient and Neolithic period, where we had different types of early humans coming over to Japan in over a land bridge, and eventually over time the land bridge disappears, and we start seeing this kind of tribal leadership popping up all over the main islands of Japan. But by the 500s to maybe the 800s, Japan started formulating its own, I think, what could be the proto-Japanese national consciousness. And they did so by looking to their neighbors to try and build something for themselves. And their neighbors that they were looking for weren't particularly Western countries. It was China. Right? So Japan at this time was heavily influenced by China. They adopted Chinese systems of government, technology, writing systems, religions. They got a strong centralized government that was led by...
If they would have looked at Western countries at this time, they would have thought that they were barbarians, because around the 600s, 700s...
Right.
If you looked at Europe, you would be like, oh, look, this is...
like a bunch of Vikings.
This is a society that is probably on the slope down right now. The power structure of the Roman Empire had fallen. So right. you would have had more of a benefit looking at Eastern systems if you were trying to find political systems that could create a court system, what they eventually build.
Right. And also, I don't think the Anglos or the Saxons or any of the Vikings or any of those people had the capacity to go over this side of the world. So they wouldn't have ever crossed paths anyway. So the most...
Come on, haven't you seen that Matt Damon movie where he's like...
This bullshit.
Where he's... some ancient Chinese warrior or something? I don't know.
That's bullshit. I did see that movie. It was entertaining for 2 hours, but it's a bad movie. It's like a Great Wall movie or something like that.
The Great Wall, starring Matt Damon. Bullshit.
Anyway, and besides, this is before that point anyway. Great Wall hadn't been built, right? And so they're basically adopting all these Chinese systems, which is not European, to build their own system, to build their own national identity that's led by, go figure, a divine emperor, right? And that's a big departure from their tribal system that they had of like hundreds of tribal lords kind of messing about in their own little corners of Japan. And at the time, they were kind of reaching a state of cultural maturity that they were ready to develop on their own line. And by the fall of the Tang Dynasty, they were basically off doing their own thing, right? They were almost completely separate from China and Chinese influence. And I think the greatest sign of this divergence between Japan and China around that time was that Japan started writing. So they started developing their own system of writing, and all of the things that we know about early Japan, we get from the Chinese who wrote it down, who they had some funny things to say about them. But now Japanese people get to write about Japan in their own context with their own words, and I think this might be one of the first places where we start seeing this national consciousness, or at least the formation of a distinctly Japanese history. This early medieval period saw some pretty big expansion. We see a lot of innovation, a lot of art, but all of it wasn't positive. There was a lot of internal struggle. The majority of the common people suffered greatly under the Japanese ruling class. In particular, poverty, famine, overtaxation. These were huge things that really burdened the common Japanese person. And obviously this caused a lot of strife and migration, frankly, among the peasant class. And a lot of them moved to more tax-friendly, privately owned estates. But even then, they were getting robbed blind by those landowners. So they kind of got the shit end of the stick for a lot of things. But this migration from state-owned land to, the state-owned land would be taxable. And moving from state-owned land to private-owned land, which was not taxable, was really the beginning of the decline of the court system that was set up at the time, and the rise of the decline of the power, the central imperial authority's power. Right, so we went from tribal to central imperial authority, and then it declines and breaks. Right, and then this period here becomes known as the Heian period. And what's important to know about the Heian period, which is about 800 to about 1200, we see the growth and the ultimate decline of the court system, and the growth and the strength of the private land ownership. And by the 10th century, we're already starting to see the practice of public land allotment, which was a practice that they had where the government would give you pieces of land and then tax you for it. Basically, that was done because they ran out of land to give out. And we started seeing new land being cleared out by private ownership that was untaxed. And this increased, the power of private landowners. Those private landowners needed to build their own private security systems to protect their interests. So this rapidly expanded the samurai class. And specifically in the last episode, we took a look at this over-romanticized idea of the samurai as this like Far East equivalent of the chivalrous like English knights, which, if you go and listen to that, we make a lot of interesting cases that this is probably not true, or at least it was something that was an idea that was written for Western audiences specifically. But the reality of the samurai was actually that they were kind of a mercenary force. They were a tool that was used to protect and promote a Japanese domestic geopolitical interest. This broke down again to the centralization of power, and kind of brings us to this Sengoku period, which is super fascinating. I think is probably the best way for us to look at, how the formation of the Japanese national consciousness really kicks in.
Well, let me jump in. So this, how China had we did an episode on this, right? Probably about a month and a half ago, on China's warring states period and how it unified. So 2,000 years ago, there was a warring. 2,500 years ago or so, there was I'm bad at math. There was a warring states period in China where all the different kingdoms were fighting, and they were, basically fighting for hegemony in mainland Asia. Japan was going through this same period, like right at this time. So this is their warring states period, and Sengoku. It's like Goku, the Dragon Ball Z character. Got
correct.
It. Sengoku. I think it literally means civil war, right?
Yep. It means the age. Well, the Sengoku Jidai, which is the full version, is the age of the Civil War.
Hutchinson, Minnesota had some problems. For the adults of Hutchinson, the problem was the teenagers. They kept sneaking off at night to empty barns where they'd, brace yourself, dance. Who knew what sort of sin and heavy petting and French literature these barn dances might lead to? No, the adults of Hutchinson, Minnesota did not approve. And neither, it seemed, did the devil. One summer night, Satan himself suddenly appeared in the middle of the dance floor, and the debauched teens ran in fear. He showed up at the next dance, too. For a few months, it seemed like you couldn't go to a late-night barn dance in Hutchinson without getting chased out by the devil, pitchfork in tow. Until one night, when a 14-year-old boy had the good sense to shoot him in the chest. At which point the devil was revealed, Scooby-Doo style but bloodier, to be the local Methodist minister, dressed in a costume and flown in from the roof by rope and pulley. This is The Constant, a history of getting things wrong. I'm Mark Chrysler. Every episode, we look at the accidents, mistakes, and bad ideas that helped misshape our world. Find us at constantpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Serial killers, strange disappearances, unexplained mysteries, terrible disasters. I'm Nate Hale, and in my show, The Conspirators, I'm here to tell you all the stories from history your teacher never told you about. Hear the real story behind the Bermuda Triangle, or about the history of people drinking blood to stay young, or about the serial killer operating in Nazi-occupied Paris, or what dark secret lurked within the walls of a Scottish castle. In my show, The Conspirators, I take you on a journey through some of the darkest corners of history, where you'll hear about the folklore, myths, and misconceptions behind some of the darkest events that ever happened. Listen to The Conspirators on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction.
So it's essentially a period when Japan is decentralized and then feudal states are fighting with one another, hashtag Age of Samurai. But I think it's important to note that there was still an emperor at this time. There was still, an emperor that these warlords were pledging, I guess, a ceremonial allegiance to, but this emperor only had a symbolic role. They would elect the shogun, but like that shogun was already predetermined. It was like a ceremonial thing. And since the 13th century, excuse me, I'm sorry, I just burped. I didn't mean to do it in a microphone. Since the 13th century, Japan was dominated by these shogunates who were warlords who would fight, who would have their own these different feudal rivalries. I saw this really funny meme, and last episode we went over like the myth of the samurai and how Bushido was used as a tool, more so as a modern nation building tool, to promote kind of martial qualities and among the Japanese civilian class.
Right.
I saw this really funny meme of a samurai looking at like another samurai, and he was like, my master called me a monkey, so I'm switching to your clan. Like reality was, I guess you have to see the meme. But I guess things get very violent around the 15th century or so, when full-scale wars really start to break out, and not only are there a lot of wars going on, but there's a lot of natural disasters in this time period as well. So there's earthquakes, a lot of people are in poverty, and a lot of these economic factors lead to a very violent period in Japan's history.
Right, and I think this period really starts off with what's called the Onin War, and that's in like 1467, and it involves thereafter 3 separate but equally transformative unifications, and the ending is not super clear. It really just depends on who you're asking. I think most people would probably put it at the Battle of Sekigahara, but also the Siege of Osaka could be an ending that is relevant. But basically, this is the period between the feudal system and the Edo period, which is ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. So just want to briefly show and talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of the elements of, Japanese nation building get created in this period, and then some of it gets undone and recreated, and it kind of flip-flops and it ebbs and flows, and not all of it is distinctly European, but some of it is. So I think it might be helpful to talk about this Onin War. The Onin War was it was a civil war. It lasted 10 years. It started as a fight about who was going to replace the shogun. The shogun was Yoshimasa. Dude had no heir at the time, and so Yoshimasa convinced his little brother Yoshimi to stop being a monk so that he can name him as the heir. But then later he ends up having a son of his own, and that obviously caused some problems. So basically, it becomes
it's kind of funny because a lot of the like final straws when it comes to different governments in Japan, it always comes to some type of succession crisis.
Yep, succession issues are big, and maybe we can say definitively that succession rights are part of the national identity of Japan, right? Or fights about it.
You are no longer my son.
I disown you.
I disown you. But yeah, the court system kind of dematerialized over a succession crisis over different families trying to marry into the emperor's family for different status reasons. But eventually that kind of led to a cycle where it became kind of like taboo. Like once someone tried to encroach, and the whole point was, you had the Holy Emperor, and then you would marry your daughter. No, you would marry a son into a daughter. Therefore, you'd have the family surrounded by your own people.
Right, and I think this is not probably not ultra unique to Japan. I think a lot of like hegemonies and all over the world are built on somewhat incestuous, marriages, but also like marriages of political convenience.
Well, look at World War I. Yep. Everyone's related.
Yep.
Basically, all the monarchs at that time you can find family photos of, like Kaiser Wilhelm and the monarchy in England. Like they're all cousins with each other.
Yep, that's true. Anyway, back to the Onin War. So we were talking about Yoshimasa. So Yoshimasa, he didn't have a heir. He convinced his little brother, who was a monk, to stop being a monk, and then he ends up having a kid, which was a problem again. And basically, it became a fight between Yoshimasa's little brother, the monk, and the baby mama, whose name was Tomiko, about who gets to be shogun. It's a really juicy story, honestly, but like we were saying, this kind of happens all the time, all across history, especially Japanese history. All right, so baby mama Tomiko, she got together some powerful leaders of samurai clans to fight with her and on behalf of her son to be the heir, while the little monk bro, Yoshimi, he wasn't little, he was just younger. He was an adult. Yoshimi had ties to the establishment forces of the Hosokawa clan, who was a vassal state of the shogun, Yoshimasa. And so baby mama, they broke into a full-out war, like crazy, 10-year-long war. And instead of it, naming a victor either the new baby or the younger brother monk, it turned into whoever's leader of whichever daimyo or warlord clan that was fighting in this civil war, whoever won, they got to be shogun. So it started with these two people, and then it was just like, all right, fuck you guys. Whoever wins the battle is the ruler. And so the actual line of succession here is super complicated, and there's a lot of names, and there's a lot of coups and things like that. So I'm not going to go into those specifics. It'll be boring. What you need to know is that by the end of it, the guy that ends up on top is named Sumimoto. But he wasn't actually a real ruler. He was a puppet to one of the warlords, one of the daimyo that fought for him. And then this highlights the whole Sengoku period's themes of there's a battle, and then they set up a puppet government, and then there's some more feudal lords who struggle to win control over that puppet government, and then they break it again, and then they set up a new puppet government, and then it goes on and on at least 3 times.
It's kind of funny that, you mentioned coups. There's a lot of coups. That is something that you can see as something that is part of Japanese national identity. Mm-hmm. Coups and assassinations. What Japan was called in the 1920s, what they were referred to as a government by assassination, because there were so many coups going on. And there are some wild ones. Like, we're going to get too off track, but there's a coup against the Prime Minister of Japan, and I believe in 1920, I might be getting this year wrong. It's called the May 4th incident, where there's literally a fucking coup with samurai swords, like chopping government officials' heads off and things like that. Like, it's out of a movie when you read about it. We'll get to that in another episode. But
For sure. Well, here's a guy who was assassinated. Spoiler alert. This is probably one of the 3 biggest dudes during the Sengoku period. His name is Oda Nobunaga.
The Netflix show.
Yep. The Netflix show starts with this guy. And for good reason, though.
Which you wouldn't recommend, right? It's not very good.
If you like Japanese history, I think you'll love it. I think you'll actually love it. You'll probably cringe at some of the ways that they overplay people's characters to make it more entertaining, or how they focus on little shit that wasn't that big. But it's cool. It's cool. That's all I have to say.
It's a show.
It's a show.
It's cool. It sounds like you're referring to like a girl you're not really into. Yeah, she's cool.
I mean, like,
she's
I got
cool.
a couple episodes in, and I was just like, all right, like, I already knew all of this. It's neat to look at it,
Yeah, that's cool.
It's cool. Anyway, this dude Oda Nobunaga, they started with him for a reason, because he is probably the juiciest of all 3 of these characters, in my opinion. Like, he has the craziest story, and I think I'll just tell you his story in like the short version. So if you're trying to watch the Netflix show, maybe skip ahead like 2 minutes. So this dude Oda Nobunaga, I'm just going to call him Nobunaga. He was his father's legitimate heir, but the rest of his clan, the Oda clan, didn't really like him because he was reckless and uninterested. He was kind of a dick, honestly. And to highlight this story, apparently he came to his father's funeral like drunk and started throwing ashes like all over the altar. That part is actually in history, but it was pretty interesting to see it in the Netflix representation. It was pretty spot on, in my opinion. But the fact that this dude Nobunaga becomes the head of the Oda clan basically pisses off a lot of people in the Oda clan, because a lot of them actually wanted his little brother to be in charge. I think his name's Nobutada. I could be wrong about that one. They all have very similar sounding names. But they wanted him to be the heir or the leader, because he was way more level-headed. Like, he was like the good child, the golden child. But, again, line of succession, Nobunaga was the oldest, so he was in charge. And so this whole story puts Nobunaga in conflict with his powerful uncle, who was basically the lord of a section of the Oda clan, and many of the other clansmen that they had. Long story short, Oda Nobunaga ends up on top, and cements his rule in the Oda clan. This is where things start getting interesting for Nobunaga. So a larger neighboring clan, led by a guy named Imagawa, he decided to whip up this giant force to march over to Kyoto to crush the weak shogunate. Remember, I was telling you how the shogunate was just a puppet government, and all of these feudal lords were trying to basically dominate and do coups so that they can install their own puppet governments. And so this guy, Imagawa, wants to go do that, but in order to do that, he has to march through Oda territory. And Nobunaga wasn't having it. This dude, instead of bending the knee, this crazy motherfucker decides to preemptively strike him, even though I think the numbers were like, it was like a 25,000 man force for Imagawa and like maybe 3,000 for Oda Nobunaga. It was like way off balance. But he was like, you know what? The way to win is to preemptively strike. And he did this crazy thing at an interesting battle called the Battle of Okahazama. So he set up all these dummy soldiers to make them look like his army is bigger. Like he put like flags and they were like made of straw and shit like that, and he put them off in the distance to make his like forces look bigger, which is hilarious. And then he takes his smaller like regiment, flanks the enemy forces, and then at night he goes in like right after a thunderstorm and basically murders everybody, like how George Washington did to the Hessians on Christmas when he crossed the Delaware River. He basically did that.
I was going to say that's like a scene from the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson. You know that scene where they act like they have British officers and they do a prisoner swap, and then they come and they're all strawmen.
Right, and then they just murder the shit out of people.
Yeah,
that's what happened. Well, he didn't murder everyone in their army, but he definitely cut the head off of their general, which basically ended the battle. Which leads me to a side tangent. Have you ever played Dynasty Warriors, or more specifically for this, Samurai Warriors?
No, I have not. I don't think I ever have.
Those games are so much fun. I used to play them all the time, and you could sit there and like just beat up on all of the random like forces. But what I used to like to do is speed run through it and just run directly to the general, because if you killed the general, you win. So I would just like bypass everybody and just go right for the general, and that's basically what Nobunaga Oda did. And so he basically sparks this camp. This solidified him as like a regional power, right? Like how did this little tiny guy who had maybe 3,000 soldiers beat up on Imagawa's forces, who had way more than him, right? Who was much more experienced, and they were on their way to just go like redo the government in Japan. How did he do this? This is actually kind of a microcosm, dude. It's a little bit microcosm of like how the Japanese beat the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, or how they beat the Russians in the Japanese-Russian War, right? The Russo-Japanese War. He's like the progenitor to that, because it was like a little microcosm of that. He was able to figure it out. And I think the reason why he was able to do this, and how he sparked this campaign of conquest, because he's like all high on his horse now. He's like, oh, I'm gonna go beat everybody up now. What's interesting about Nobunaga is that he has very, very forward-thinking ideas, and ideas about how to set up his government and his rule. Most notably, what won him battles was that, and especially against like forces that were bigger than his or more experienced than his, was the fact that he had a propensity to adopt new technology, like guns. Other clans had guns too, but he loved guns. He bought so many guns from the Portuguese, and he would start arming and training regular peasant soldiers on how to use guns, and it was incredibly effective. And
yeah, you think?
It was incredibly effective. And the thing at the time is like, there was this like ruling samurai class that had this like monopoly of violence, right? And Oda Nobunaga was like, nah, I'm gonna give guns to the rice farmer, and that's how we're gonna win. So it's super interesting, very progressive.
It's a way easier way to conduct war, I would say, is to just upgrade and just create an actual standing army, because that's what he did essentially. Instead of that monopoly of violence being enforced solely by an aristocratic hereditary class, now finally you're giving peasants guns and peasants the ability to pull a trigger and
make boomstick go
take
boom.
Away basically be more effective than years and years of sword training and the most expensive armor in the world. Like now,
that's right.
Now that is defunct because there are guns, and bullets, unfortunately for you, pierce steel armor.
Right. And what's interesting about that is also had the effect of creating more loyalty among his people for Oda Nobunaga, because now it's like he's not just circle jerking the samurai class or the aristocrats. He's saying like, no, we're all in this together. Like, here's a gun, let's fight for our land. And this was, again, a microcosm of like this national identity, because he formed this identity among his clan and among the clans that he integrated into his clans of like, even the rice farmers have a stake in it, So there's more cohesion, more of an identity, like a shared experience, kind of like going to the same university, that's starting to happen right here. And some other things that he did, he fucking built iron-plated warships, and he industrialized the production of artillery and other ammunition. But outside of just military policy, there was a lot of other policies that made Nobunaga really great. So he instituted a lot of free trade policies. He broke up trade monopolies. And most importantly, I think he set up free markets to boost Japan's economy. So as he starts, widening his control, he's setting up literally a free market. If it wasn't for the fact that he's like a sovereign ruler, you might think that these are kind of libertarian policies that he put into place, because he knew that the more we trade and, the more trading is free and we have open and fair markets, the more his country and his people are going to prosper.
Well, I mean, he was a direct benefit of the free market in terms of the weapons trade.
Exactly.
If he wasn't trading for the better military technology at the time from the 15th century Portuguese.
Right. Exactly.
Then he would have been rendered ineffective. And I mean, he would have certainly not have had the advantage that he had during these wars.
Mm-hmm. Oh, not even close. Now, less libertarian things that he did, though, he set up central administrations. He did a lot of currency regulation. But he also built roads and bridges to connect his provinces. And this also consequently was a military thing because it allowed him to move his troops around easier to conquer others. So that was super interesting.
Road building, a lot of times, this older building roads in these societies always relates to getting information from one place to another as fast as possible in order to increase the size and scope of what areas you control. Because if you can't get information out to somewhere, then technically it's the boondocks, you know what I mean? Right. So it's much more difficult to claim sovereignty over that area without a road network to get a messenger in there to go there and say, I am speaking on behalf of the king. You owe us 10 goats and 15 shillings.
Yep. He also did a bunch of cultural things too. He built beautiful gardens and castles and shit. And he basically set up, major parts of the Japanese tea ceremony, which is I would argue is part of, the Japanese identity. Is this famous Japanese tea ceremony?
That is it. We nailed it, Danny.
Yep.
We nailed it.
We
nailed Japanese nationalism. Tea ceremonies.
Tea ceremony. Tea party.
Tea ceremonies.
Yep. I mean, they really do like their tea ceremonies, to be honest.
That's how the state was formed.
That's a fair assertion. They love their tea ceremonies.
I think you broke the case. You ever see My Cousin Vinny?
Yeah.
Our last episode, my girlfriend was watching My Cousin Vinny in the other room while we were playing it. So it's we were podcasting, and I was listening still to it. I love the part where he's like, honey, you broke the case. You have the picture. Me in the shower.
That's it. You broke the case. It's the tea ceremony.
It's the tea ceremonies. That's what what they were yelling during kamikaze missions.
Yeah.
Japanese tea. Sorry.
No, it's all right. To kind of wrap up on Nobunaga, though, just to end on him, because I focused the most on him because I found him the most interesting and I found him the most transformative. But we have some other people to look at too. Ending on Nobunaga, he made Japan an open state to the outside world, right? And so you could argue that the modernization of Japan and the formation of Japanese nationalism was influenced by Western culture, by Western places like England or like Portugal, things like that, because of how open Nobunaga made Japan and because of the influences that he drew from outside. I mean, for God's sakes, he let Christians in, and he set up the first Jesuit missionaries in Christian churches. He never himself converted, but still. But the thing is that, from the very beginning...
Well, he should have.
Go ahead.
He should have.
You should have, right?
You should have just converted right there.
That would have done it in. They would have done. I mean, from the very beginning, he was working with the Portuguese to get guns and other armaments, which helped him rise to power. But even after he came to power, he continued this pattern of like open free trade and like modernization by absorbing the best elements of outside red, specifically Western, culture. So in a way, Nobunaga is kind of
the precursor to Meiji Japan. The Meiji government, who are adopting all these things, not from China, but from the West. From the West.
Exactly. But he makes the argument, I guess, Nobunaga, it might be a good argument for saying that Japanese nationalism was a product of diffusion.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. That's one argument.
Well, I think we should put a pin on that and go over some of these other shogunates, because I think we'll have some contradicting times in Japanese history that I think you can argue. Obviously, it's a combination of all these things together, and it's like kind of defining why somebody is crazy. You know what I mean? Or why somebody is just like a certain way, or why somebody is a sociopath. People don't know what is in someone's brain. I'm not referring to Japanese people as sociopaths. I'm just saying, like, these are questions where you don't really know why people act. It's like, we don't know the question of nature versus nurture type of thing.
Right.
But
like, was Japanese nationalism nature or nurture in this case?
Yeah.
Well, let's look at another guy, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who I'll call Hideyoshi. He was probably known as the second great unifier of Japan during the Sengoku period. He was your typical rags to riches story. He's actually a product of Nobunaga's, transformative, period, because he started off as a peasant, and he eventually rose to become his successor. So one way that helped Hideyoshi during the Nobunaga reign was his negotiation skills. So he was actually able to get a lot of warlords to come over to the Nobunaga camp. Oftentimes with just straight up bribing them. But this skill was super useful for him in a way to help him to help Nobunaga consolidate power, but also it would help prove himself useful. And ultimately, when he rose to power, it was useful for himself as well. So eventually Nobunaga and his eldest son, they were both assassinated. So go figure, we were talking about this a minute ago. They got murked.
Government by assassination.
Exactly, right? And Hideyoshi here, he was super loyal to Nobunaga because, again, he came from nothing, and Nobunaga gave him a chance, and he rose to power, right? So Hideyoshi wanted to get revenge, which he ultimately did by defeating all of Nobunaga's enemies and reunifying Japan. But he used this victory to secure power for himself. Well, why not? He did the work. While he was in power, Hideyoshi changed Japanese society in many ways. So he's kind of forming somewhat different ideas of a Japanese identity. So he imposed a rigid class structure, which greatly affected both the peasants and the warrior classes. He basically said all peasants have to be disarmed from now on, which, now I'm thinking back on it, is kind of hypocritical because he was a peasant. But just something I just thought of right now.
Fucking liberals.
Fucking liberals. He took this guy's total typical liberal. He took all the guns away, right? And this helped him to strengthen his monopoly on power, and it also allowed the samurai class to basically squat in castle towns during times of peace, which created a clear power structure that was like this elite class over the regular class. And this was actually maintained throughout the Edo period, right? There's like strong, firm, rigid class structure.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely a huge characteristic of the Edo period in Tokugawa Japan, that this very rigid class structure that doesn't really work with an...
Well, I mean, it worked for like 300 years.
It worked.
Yeah.
doesn't work well now.
No, not at all.
It doesn't work well now, but
no, not anymore. But it worked for 300 years, and Hideyoshi is a large reason why this was a thing. He also did this thing where he was surveying land, taking account of all the land, and also he performed a census to count all the people. And he did this so that he basically, once he did the census and he figured out who was who and where did they live, he restricted people's movement inside of Japan, right? And he said, all right, if you are in the Okinawa prefecture, you live there, and that's where you live, and you can't go anywhere else unless you get special permission from the central government. And it was kind of tyrannical in many ways, but his moral justification for this was to crack down on roaming bandits, which were a really big problem. So the idea was, if you're not allowed to have free range of motion, then the only people that are moving around are bandits. So we are able to identify them easier and crush them. That was the logic behind it. But really, honestly, I think it was more about taxation. If you didn't move around a lot, we knew where you were, we knew who you were, we know where you are, so I can tax you. I can tax you appropriately.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to tax somebody when they're just
when they're in place.
they're in place, and they're it's way easier to tax somebody who's like has a stable job and in place. There's not a lot of movement. It's very easy to has their paperwork on time.
Yeah, exactly.
Always files early.
A lot of this shit was pretty repressive from Hideyoshi, but some of it was pretty progressive. He effectively ended the practice of slave labor after he built Osaka Castle.
Did he use slaves to build Osaka Castle?
He did.
Okay. Did he? He ended the practice of slavery after using slavery all of his life, but at least he ended it.
Yeah. I mean, he technically didn't end it entirely. So like indentured servitude was still a thing, which is different from slavery, but it's pretty damn close. And also, if you were like a prisoner, basically they can use you as a slave. But
I mean,
like
that's
just
what we have here.
Like ownership of people just by
the U.S.
virtue
we
of,
do the same thing with prison with like in California, how prisoners fight firefighters and
exactly
the license plates.
Yeah. So we got the idea from Hideyoshi Toyotomi. But yeah, he ended the practice of slave labor. He also this was pretty progressive for the time at least. He had these policies set up to balance the power of the local daimyos, because remember, in the periods before him, there was all these like local warlords that were vying for power, right? And so what he did was he spread out and diversified the power balance between all of these local warlords to help secure more stability in the Japanese nation state, basically spreading the wealth and the power around more equitably so that we can have more stability. And that is very progressive, right? And this was, held up for a while until he got his ass spanked in the Battle of Sekigahara by Tokugawa. But different story for later. He also had a hard-on about tea ceremonies like Nobunaga. He was big on the tea ceremonies. I think most importantly about Hideyoshi was something that would fuel Japanese imperialism, which is, I think, we can make the argument that it is part of the national identity of Japan. Probably not part of it that they want to talk a lot about, but it definitely is a part of Japanese national identity, imperialism. And basically, towards the end of Hideyoshi's life, he wanted to solidify a legacy for himself. And to do so, he basically wanted to act on Nobunaga's dream of conquering China. So Nobunaga had these grand ideas. He was like, well, I got all of Japan. I want to go over to China and just spank them too, right? Basically, he was in contact with Korea. Hideyoshi was in contact with Korea for many years, and he was trying to broker safe passage through Korea to get to Manchuria, right? But the eventually the Koreans just were like, nah. The reason why they said no was because they knew that if they allowed a safe passage of Japanese forces through Korea, that the Ming dynasty, the Ming Chinese forces, would march into Korea to prevent the Japanese from getting into the Chinese mainland. And they weren't trying to have their fucking home be like the battleground between these two powers. And this actually pissed off Hideyoshi so much that he decided to invade Korea. And he did good in the beginning, actually. In the first 4 months, he occupied a lot of Korea. And he, had basically a direct road into Manchuria. But it didn't last forever. And eventually he got spanked by what was the last limbs of the Korean Navy. This dude, Admiral Yi Sun-sin, basically destroyed the entire Japanese fleet, which made it impossible for them to resupply their forces in Pyongyang. But this is kind of like the bits where we can make the argument that Japanese imperialism started here, right? The idea of like, we're good enough to move beyond our borders, and we're no longer, absorbing the cultures of others. We're now imposing upon others.
Do you want to know what it's like to hang out with MS-13 in El Salvador? How the Russian mafia fought battles all over Brooklyn in the 1990s?
Or what about that time I got lost in the Burmese jungle hunting the world's biggest meth lab? Or why the Japanese Yakuza have all those crazy dragon tattoos? I'm Sean Williams.
And I'm Danny Gold. And we're the hosts of the Underworld Podcast. We're journalists that have traveled all over, reporting on dangerous people and places. And every week, we'll be bringing you a new story about organized crime from all over the world.
We know this stuff because we've been there. We've seen it. And we've got the near misses and embarrassing tales to go with it. We'll mix in reporting with our own experiences in the field, and we'll throw in some bad jokes while we're at it.
The Underworld Podcast explores the criminal underworlds that affect all of our lives, whether we know it or not. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the future in this year's wildest, super fun show for adults.
Hey gang, it's Josh Olson.
And Joe Dante.
And we want to tell you about our podcast. It's about movies.
Josh, there are 1,000 podcasts about movies.
Sure, but ours is different, Joe.
That's true, actually. Our guests are writers, directors, musicians, comedians, actors.
Hell, we even have other podcasters on.
We play no favorites, and they don't talk so much about their own work, but about the movies that have influenced them and made them who they are. We call it The Movies That Made Me.
We've talked with people like Guillermo del Toro, Little Stevie Van Zandt, Martin Short, Ethan Hawke, William Friedkin, Barbara Crampton, Jonathan Ross, Dennis Lehane, Mark Duplass, Adam McKay, Lorraine Newman, Jason Reitman, Alison Anders, Elijah Wood, Stephen Canals, Eli Roth, Joe Bob Briggs, Roger Corman, Bobcat Goldthwait, Ileana Douglas, Dana Gould, Martin Campbell, Shane Black, Albert Hughes, Emily Deschanel, Joe Biafra, Larry Fessenden, Nicole Hausen, Shaka King, Lee Daniels, Rosalind Chow, Clancy Brown, Yardley Smith, Ike Barinholtz, Steve Arquette, Thomas Welton, Gina Prince Lightfoot, and Uwe Boll.
It may not be highbrow, but it's lots of fun.
Subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts.
In color to thrill you as never before.
Well, on a side note, I wonder if Admiral Yi Sun-sin is a figure in like North Korean history or North Korean mythology or legend. Do you think that he would if he
I bet he is.
Based that I don't really know that much about this, so I don't know about like the propaganda that comes in North Korea or like
nobody knows.
But yeah, no, that's the thing. Nobody knows. But I'm wondering if that is like a figure, if he's resupplying forces in Pyongyang, which is the capital right now of North Korea.
Right.
That's interesting with this, this constant obsession with conquering China or conquering the mainland has always existed.
Yep.
In Japan, or has existed, not always existed, but has been in the mind of a lot of like key power players within Japan for a long time. And it's funny to see how that never really left the system or never really left the consciousness of a lot of people until, I mean, it was in their consciousness from the time they invaded China in the 20th century. So
even before that, as I pointed out, I think even back here for Toyotomi, Hideyoshi Toyotomi put that idea in the Japanese consciousness.
So let's talk about the rise of Tokugawa, because we have the largest battle in, I guess, samurai history that comes up around the year 1605 or 16. I don't know what the exact date. It's like early 1600s.
You're talking about Sekigahara, right?
The Battle of Sekigahara, where there's a battle, something like 50, like a large scale battle. I don't know what the exact numbers are. I've just seen pictures of it, but this is where you see the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate when he emerges as like the major power player in the 17th century in Japan.
Right, and he was the third major unifier during the Sengoku period.
What is interesting is that this is when Japan enters a period of peace. So there's a 200 period of peace and isolation, and what Tokugawa is mostly known for is he ends all that, like trading, free market stuff, being favorable to Christianity.
Right.
They end that system where they shut down the borders. If you are a foreigner and if you come on Japanese soil, your head's going to be cut off once you hit that soil. Like, you're not allowed to be there. And we talked about this briefly earlier. Like, the Dutch, the only people that, one of the big reasons why they limited trade with the outside world is because of Christian missions that they thought were meddling too much in Japanese politics.
Right.
The only government or only Western state that they trusted to trade with, and they didn't really trust them, were the Dutch. And
because they were the least Christian of the Christian nations.
Yeah, exactly. So the Portuguese were the first major traders with Japan.
And they were heavily Catholic.
Yeah, they were very Catholic. And there's a really big massacre. And man, I forget the year of this. I probably should have came prepared for it. But where the Japanese, they take a ship of I don't remember if they were missionaries or if they were merchants. It probably was a combination of both, right?
Both,
like,
yeah.
You know, like I guess if you're making a voyage from Portugal to Japan at that time, that takes a couple of months to get there. So
right.
Those ships are packed with everyone who wants to go there, which probably includes merchants and preachers of Jesus Christ. And the ship is caught, and everyone is brutally killed and executed on this ship. And that was like the first sign of like, hey, we're done with this system. We are closing our borders. And essentially what Edo Japan becomes, is it Edo or Edo? I just want to make sure that I'm not pronouncing it for all
like
the
American
dorks.
English would be Edo, but Edo would be
Edo.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm gonna stick with the American way. Edo, Edo, Japan. So Edo Japan was a pseudo unified pre-modern feudal state where the military class across the country submitted to the Tokugawa shogunate, and they paid annual tributes and missions, and they still had local administrative autonomy, but the Tokugawa shogunate was the most powerful of all of these different unifiers over the past 200-year period. And
it's so interesting to see that the piece that came out of it was distinctly a result of shutting themselves off from the rest of the world. So kind of almost backtracking on the idea, like if you were to say that the Japanese national identity started at Tokugawa, then you would say that the national identity is independent of Western nations. That nationalism was independent of that and wasn't a part of diffusion.
Well, here's what I have to say about Tokugawa, because this is a 200-year period of peace. So you see a lot of shit like changes within the hierarchy system where these samurai are no longer warrior classes. They have less to do. They have less to. They need to take on new roles because they're not constantly at war. And something that the Tokugawa shogun did is that they promoted Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism was the official political doctrine because Confucian ideology emphasized hierarchy. And why that was important was because Confucian education offered moral prestige to that aristocratic society who may have less to do on the battlefield, but now still has a place in like, you know, government politics and things like that. So it is effectively creating loyalty within that warlord society to the shogunate, to the shogunate. So I think those, or at least was a reason why Confucianism was pushed by Tokugawa.
Yep.
And what's interesting is that they employed Chinese writing. Now, just hold on to this thought. At the same time, you have the rise of Tokugawa Japan in China, and this is going to mirror earlier Japanese history. In China, you have the Ming Dynasty falling apart. In 644, the Ming Dynasty officially falls apart. It sounds a lot like back in the year in the 7th and 8th century when the Tang Dynasty fell apart.
Right.
And then Japan was like, all right,
we're doing our own thing. Right.
We're like, okay, these guys are no longer interesting.
Right.
We no longer want to really follow their lead.
The ancient Japanese are real fair weather fans to other nations, aren't they? Right? They're only like, you know, they're only really watching you if you're in the playoffs, basically.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's another theme that is common. So they copy whenever they're influenced by a culture, that they will start regarding them as decadent once they have like proven themselves unworthy. So like the Tang Dynasty, when that disintegrated, they're like, all right, I don't think we're gonna be sending missions over to China anymore. They're not, you know, they're falling apart. And then the same thing happens with the Ming Dynasty in 644. And then you see that same pattern of behavior later on in the 20th century when or in the 19th century rather, when Japan's first military advisors were the French. They were the last samurai, which we spoke about on our Patreon last week. We did a full episode like discussing the last samurai and their historical accuracies. That story is kind of based on a French officer rather than an American officer. And when France loses to Prussia during the Franco-Prussian War, Japan observes that and they're like, okay, these guys are not. Why are we copying? We should be dealing with the Germans.
Yeah,
you're not cool anymore. We want Prussia to be our military advisors. Again, they're adopting a lot of those Prussian martial qualities into their own society at that time, which is just another element in the pot that you're stewing right now to create this fanatic nationalism that does arise in the 20th century. Ultimately, the story that we're trying to, or the point we're trying to tell in these episodes. But to go back on the Ming Dynasty falling apart, in order to identify the moral cause of the Ming's demise, Confucian scholars engaged in something called rereading the old classical Confucian texts. And they did that because they wanted to advise contemporary governments on how to avoid to suffer those same fates. This actually inspires another movement that is interested in studying old Japanese text. And this kind of evolves into this proto-Japanese national movement in the 18th century Japan. And what the primary goal of this movement is discovering what is Japan. So, like what we're doing right now, what this podcast is, like what is this thing? So this intellectual movement emerges during the time of the Tokugawa shogunate. It's not endorsed by the Tokugawa shogunate. It's honestly at odds with Confucian principles, but it emerges around this time in discovering Japanese identity. And the easiest way, or the what you can compare this to is Western Romanticism that emerges in the 19th century, like the Western Romanticism that emerges with really idealizing the past, with really like looking like, oh man, like we were so great back in the day.
Right.
We had such honor and virtues in, those times, and back in, whatever the hell empire that we say claimed to exist at one period or another, or whatever the hell kingdom when we say claim to exist at one period of time.
Right.
We need to capture the essence and spirit of those societies and spread them to our civilian population. So that was kind of like the essence of this movement founded by Moturi Norinaga, who is he's like kind of like the founder of this so-called proto-nationalist movement. And what they engage in is that these Japanese scholars, they start to see the foreign influence in old Japanese writings as bad. So they try to purge foreign influence out of old Japanese texts. So they're literally going through these old documents, because think about it, everything's written in Chinese back then.
Right.
This is before the Japanese phonetic language was out. So they're looking and they're trying to like,
and they're reading the Kojiki.
Subjectively.
Right. They're like the ancient books, the Kojiki, which was written in Chinese, right?
Yeah. So they're like subjectively like, this is too Chinese sounding. They're pulling this out. This is too, no, that's not something Japanese. They're like kind of constructing what is Japan narrative is. Like they're trying to create this movement
by excising the foreign influence.
Yeah. Which is impossible, which is an impossible task to do at that time, because the first court governments were too heavily inspired by China to not have to be able to purge that and separate the two. Like, yeah, there is a time period in Japanese history, as we discussed in 2 episodes ago in the origins of Japanese feudalism episode, where there was this very thriving Japanese culture that existed, like this court culture that kind of resembled like the French court politics before the French Revolution, like very hoity-toity and obsessed with cultural improvements and things like that. However, what their argument was Japan in antiquity was a utopian society. Right. Like it was a perfect society. And
according
this state of bliss was lost because of the contamination of Chinese and Korean or any other foreign influence at those times. Mm-hmm. So that state of bliss was ruined. However, it was still possible to recover those pristine conditions enjoyed by the ancient Japanese. Therefore, they had to pick and choose what they felt was Japanese. I don't know what is the process of doing that or how that process works, and creating a national narrative and picking and choosing what you think is like uniquely Japanese. Like, oh, that's something that Japanese would say. Oh, that's something that Chinese would say. We should take that out of the books. But it's interesting that these movements were created. And I think the greater context of that is that this was, you wouldn't say Confucianism inspired this, but this was, you could see that it was a consequence of Confucianism due to Confucian, the Confucian model of looking at ancient texts to kind of warn future governments of things that they should avoid doing. However, it began to become at odds with Confucianism because ultimately Confucianism was a foreign influence in China. But it's so hard, just going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's really difficult to kind of nail this stuff down and really create like a perfect stew or a perfect like formula of like what created a specific culture. There's just so many factors, and there's so many different circumstances that involve that ultimately lead to, you know, what is inserted into nationalism, or what's inserted into, you know, the educational material endorsed by a nation state to get everyone on the same page so we can live in the same country and then want to die for that same country. It's so hard to just like pick and choose those factors. I don't know. Would you agree on that? Like, are you in the same predicament that I am? Because, you know, I feel I'm always in this, I'm in like this kind of weird situation. And I think a lot of people get this is like, the more you learn about things, the more you learn about a subject, the more you learn about the more you learn about how much you don't know about that subject. Mm-hmm. And I find it happening to me a lot.
Yeah, dude. Totally. You know, you would think that like reading some of these things would like help you to like answer some of these questions. And like coming back to one of the early questions, you know, that you asked, you know, while we were recording this, you know, do we think that nationalism was uniquely a European phenomenon, or, you know, was it organic within Japan? Or, you know, the other question where, you know, you kind of ask about what's the foundation of the Japanese national consciousness, and we dive into all of these examples, and we're getting sometimes contradictory, like mixed messages. You know, it's like we're barely scratching the surface here, and it's like so hard to have a definitive conclusion. It's kind of both.
It is, and I think where I'm at this point, I think that so Japanese nationalism was a combination that, like, the spirit of Japanese nationalism was always existed. However, the Western template of using that consciousness to create a state, like to create an actual state, was used during the Meiji period. Like, that's kind of where I'm at right there.
Yeah, it was like a useful synthesis, you know? It's like, oh, these two things work well together, you know?
So I guess going back to the theories of multiple modernity, like, can nationalism or modernity ultimately exist without like all of the factors that we associate with a modern country? Like, and when I say like modernity, it usually means some type of like either constitution or representative government, even if it's a monarchy. Like, you know, these monarchies in the 19th century and 20th century, they still had some form of parliamentary governments. Like, even like the most kind of oppressive ones did. Like, they would have their parliaments and they'd have some type of power. There'd be some barter or some kind of mutual agreement between the monarchy and like the civilian population, like that they would have their right to vote in certain people and have different powers and regulations.
Have certain say in what goes on. Yeah.
You know, that's a part of modernity. Another, obviously the industrialization is a huge 100%. Part of it. Yep. But I think the biggest factor is the mass education, you know, is the ability to mass communicate a common message to everyone and to have them think about the same way. Because, man, I bet if I asked every single person who's listening to this podcast, would you die for this country? I think I would get like a 95% chance yes. Like, I would probably say yes. You know, like, would you die for this country?
Whatever country you might be from.
Yeah. Would you die for America? Would you die for Australia? Would you die for Canada? Would you die? Well, you're not going to die for Canada. You're going to die. Hey, I think I'll just move to America, I'll just move down to the States,
I'm so sorry, but I don't want to die for Canada.
I'm so sorry. I think, okay, you could take us. You could just take my maple farm.
Sorry, Canada.
We just get some ice rings. We'll just go to Minnesota. It's cold there, right? We like it cold. I don't know. I think it's a terrible Canadian accent, right?
Yeah, you slipped into Midwestern pretty quickly.
What's that?
You slipped into Midwestern pretty easily.
I think I went into like Minnesota accent. Minnesota. You know why? Because I was fucking watching clips of Fargo the other day.
Oh,
like,
God.
it was not the movie, but the clips of Fargo.
Mm-hmm.
Where's my daughter? Where's my daughter? Shut up. The dad. Give me back my daughter. Fuck, man. That's not the intelligent way I wanted to end that, but you know, it is what it is. I'm not an intelligent man, as you clearly could probably see by listening, or probably observe by listening to this show. You know, not the brain, not a brain like Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, we're not the brainy types.
Who has some like great way to bring this back and just like, oh, it all made sense. Everything all the nonsense that he was saying for the past hour and a half, he tied it up in a nice little bow. Usually mine's like, just.
Well, that's all I know.
That's everything I know. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, you tell me.
You tell me. I just
saying. Read the shit.
I just read this shit and basically summarize it and say like, holy fuck. Give commentary. We're third party sources of information.
Yep. We're like living spark notes.
Yeah. Living spark notes with some occasional jokes that you may or may not find funny.
Well,
all right, bro historians.
I hope you find it funny.
bro historians. Why do we denigrate our podcast like this at the end of it? We're just like, yeah, we're fucking idiots. Do you have anything else to say? I am.
No, man, I'm wiped, and I think we covered a ton. Maybe on the next go we'll talk more specifically about gunboat diplomacy or the rise of the Meiji Restoration or something like that.
Yeah, we are going to be going into the final nationalization processes, where we further talk about modernity in Japan, and we talk further into the rise of fanatic Japanese nationalism, which leads to, can you say, some friction between Sino and Japanese relationships? Ha ha ha.
Indubitably.
Indubitably. What does that word even mean? Indubitably. Oh, Reginald, I indubitably disagree with you. All right, guys. Thanks again for listening to another episode. I'm sure things got weird on this one, but I mean, that's what you should expect if you continue to listen to this show, for things to be continuously weird. But I hope you enjoy it, and at the very least, you're entertained and you learn maybe something. Make sure, if you like this show, rate and review the podcast. If you're listening to Apple, it is very much appreciated when you rate and review the podcast. Again, it is the number one way to help us continue to grow this show, is to rate and review. If you guys aren't listening on Apple, to share our podcast on whatever social media outlet, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Tell a friend. That's probably the best way. Word of mouth. Say, hey, buddy, I have these two guys who talk about history on a podcast form, and you should listen to them as well. And then we are putting more effort into our Patreon. We've released 3 supplementary episodes on this topic, including episodes on the influence on China on Japan, and then as well as a breakdown of The Last Samurai on our Patreon.
Which is a lot of fun, by the way.
Which is a lot of fun. So we are releasing bonus episodes on our Patreon, and we are putting them. We are giving you these episodes that we record early. We're providing early access. So join us on our Patreon at Bro History, and then that's pretty much it. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful day and a wonderful week if you're listening to this on Sunday. And Danny, have anything to add?
Oh, man. Peace.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We will be back next week, and have a wonderful rest of your evening or day. Peace.
If you like this podcast, can we recommend another one? It's called Big Picture Science. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts, and its name tells part of the story. The big picture questions and the most interesting research in science.
Seth and I are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I am Molly, and I'm a science journalist. And we talk to people smarter than us, and we have fun along the way. The show is called Big Picture Science, and as Seth said, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.